Hello friends. I'm Madi, and you are very welcome to Magic Secret For You channel. If you have not been a member of my channel yet, please subscribe to my channel right now by clicking the subscribe button, and be sure to activate the bell button to be informed of my next videos. And in the meantime, I would be very grateful to you if you support me with likes and comments, and be sure to write your comments and criticisms for me. Well, let's not procrastinate anymore and go to the video. First of all, please watch this video without prejudice, and whatever your beliefs, even if it is against your beliefs, be sure to watch it to the end and then comment. But please judge this video fairly and with a clear conscience. In the world we live in, and especially in the period in which we are, and especially in response to the seemingly civilized and societies with secular insights, the issue of hijab has been defined as a limitation for human beings. Of course, communities whose religion and religious books have also been distorted are also included in this story, which I will explain in detail in the other videos about religions and the distortions that have taken place in them, with sufficient documents and evidence in this regard. Do you really think that hijab is a kind of restriction and contrary to freedom and human rights? Do you think that hijab is only for women and men are exempt from this law? Well, if you think so, be sure to watch this video to the end. First of all, let's look at this outside of religion and move on to history, and that means that I am talking about it without prejudice and citing historical evidence, and I invite you to think about it. The religion of Islam has been brought to mankind for about 1,400 years, and the religion of Christianity has been brought about 622 years before that, and the religion of Judaism has been brought about 480 years before Christianity. Well, we go back a little bit to something like 2,500 or 2,600 years ago, and I think that's enough. It is better to get a brief acquaintance with the meaning of the word hijab and then go to the next explanation. Hijab is an Arabic word meaning veil, and since the property of veil is to cover and create privacy, hijab is also used to mean covering. What is in history is the product of the lives of billions of people. The study of our history informs us of the events that happened to the nations of the past and their individual and collective reactions to these events. History tells us which nation progressed and which nation regressed. History teaches us how cultural change has affected the rise or fall of civilizations in the long run. Historians believe that the purpose of studying history is not simply to know people and events, but also to understand the state of social life and the changes in human societies. Because familiarity with human social life throughout history leads to a better and more understanding of today's society. Studying the history of hijab and also examining the status of women in the family and in society can clarify the effect of clothing on the family and social status of women. The history of hijab in the world has been studied in many historical books. According to history, the hijab has been common among women since ancient times and in all parts of the world. Of course, its amount is not the same everywhere and has been used in different ways. Scientists believe that secrecy is a natural thing. This means that according to acquired customs, human laws, or even religious rules have not been formed. Of course, it goes without saying that human laws and religious rules have played a significant role in changing and completing the hijab. In particular, the divine religions, considering that they correspond to human nature, have emphasized the observance of hijab and have determined its limits. According to Pak, the presence of women at high levels of society, lack of cheap access, cleanliness, religious beliefs, and security are the most important reasons why women's clothing has been worn throughout history. The reliefs and sculptures of antiquity show that the covering of the head and hair has a historical background. Historians say that headscarves, or headscarves, are more common among highly socialized women. In contrast, maids, prostitutes, and dancers wore less clothing. According to Pak, the presence of women at high levels of society, lack of cheap access, cleanliness, religious beliefs, and security are the most important reasons why women's clothing has been worn throughout history. Durant writes in his History of Civilization, Volume 1, About Mesopotamian civilization. As civilization progressed, their clothing grew taller. In one of the works of 4000 BC, known as Walsang, a Mesopotamian woman with a surviving figure covers her head with a small piece of cloth. In ancient Egypt, women's clothing was longer and more complete than men's clothing. In 3000 BC, in Egyptian paintings, girls covered their entire bodies, and boys covered their lower half. In the relief in Tel al-Amarna in Egypt, the image of the queen is seen with a veil. The Larousse Encyclopedia also writes in this regard, Greek women covered their faces and limbs up to their feet. This cover, which was clear and very beautiful, was made on the islands of Corsica, emerges in other islands. The women of the city of Thebe even covered their faces with cloth. This cloth had 2 holes that were placed in front of the eyes so that they could see. In Sparta, the surviving rolls indicate that women covered their heads, but their faces were open. Writes Will Durant in History of Civilization. In ancient times, women only attended religious ceremonies and theaters if they were fully veiled. The Romans punished those who wore tight clothing. The women wore ankle-length robes called stoles, and when they left the house, they covered the whole body up to the feet with a long chador, and nothing could be seen from the protrusions on the body. In the first centuries until the 16th century, European women wore clothes. Will Durant, famous historian, writes in this regard, the height of the clothes of the noble European women reached to the feet. Noble women rarely appeared in public. In Europe, men and women wore long shirts with long sleeves that completely covered the body. Men's clothing was short, but women's clothing, especially of noble European women, was multi-layered and long on the ground. Men wore hats and women wore scarves that covered their hair, head, and shoulders. In England, the sleeves of women's clothing were up to the elbows or wrists and their skirts were stretched on the floor. It was customary for Queen Elizabeth to wear silk socks. Most educated women married early. The British bring up girls with dignity and love. In Shakespeare's time, women had no right to appear on stage, boys played the role of women. In France, women often wore long skirts, loose-fitting overcoats, and black silk scarves, along with skirts and stockings. History of Clothing translated by Shireen Bozorgmer. Women considered premarital chastity and postmarital fidelity as a means of decency from disrespect. Women rode puffy pants under their shirts while riding. In Spain, the chastity of women was maintained not only by religion and law but also by honor. Chaste women ate away from men and sat in closed carriages while in public. After the arrival of Islam in Spain, formerly Andalusia, the robe of Iranian origin was added to men's clothing and women wore large chadors. Some women covered all their faces, except for men's eyes, and hid their legs so unobtrusively that if lovers could see it for a moment, they would have fulfilled one of their most exciting dreams. Women in theaters sat in a special area and covered their faces with netting. Whereas in the 17th century a woman seldom allowed men to see her feet, now, in the 18th century, her skirt was shortened and she was slightly off the ground, and outpatients who were previously without heels were replaced by pointed high-heeled shoes. Historical research shows that the hijab of Iranian women in ancient times, that is, before the arrival of Islam in Iran, was unique in the world. As far as the famous Austrian historian Will Durant believes, the creators of the hijab in the world are Iranians. The reliefs of this period show that women in society did not wear tight clothes and body shape. According to research by German archaeologists on Assyrian clay tablets, free Assyrian women wore hijab when attending public services around 1200 BC, but prostitutes and slaves were forbidden to wear them to be recognized. Loose clothing is a sign of greatness and civilization, and tight clothing was considered an insult and uncivilized. James Liver writes, in the Nineveh reliefs, the faces of women are rarely seen, while the faces of many men are seen. From some motifs left over from the Achaemenid period, we come across women who have interesting clothing. Their shirt is a simple and long cover or has a pleated line and short sleeves. There are other women who ride horses from the side. They put a rectangular veil over all their clothes, and under it, a shirt with a long skirt, and under it, another long shirt up to the ankles is visible. The tent, which is called the Iranian tent, is the same tent that was used from the Achaemenid period, but at that time was rectangular or square. Over time, this tent has changed and become a semicircle. Another evidence that many cite as evidence of Iranian women wearing the hijab is the pazarik carpet, which belongs to the Achaemenid period and is worn by women who cover their hair and body. In the Parthian period, the general rule was that women should be separated from men, because the inside of the Parthian nobility was separate from the outside. Parthian women wore pleated trousers and long-sleeved shirts. They were also like Achaemenid women in covering their heads and wearing chadors, and their turbaned hats almost covered most of their hair. The clothes were so long that you could not see the shoes. Well, now let's go to the history of human nudity. Will Durant examines the history of nudity in his History of Civilization. He writes about nudity in ancient times and in ancient civilizations. In societies devoid of spirituality and morality, women are always abused as a means to the physical pleasures of men. In ancient Greece and Rome, due to the prevalence of hedonistic ideology, all morality was questioned. The values that governed society changed and the gods were portrayed naked. In Greek mythology, even the gods suffered sexual perversion, debauchery, and pleasure. In these societies, a woman's physical attraction was introduced as a virtue, and rulers and politicians, based on their own interests, sometimes made single, married and even incestuous women their means of pleasure and sometimes forced them into political marriages, and when their intentions were fulfilled, these women, they left. A brothel or prostitution association was formed, homosexuality and incest were rampant. Debauchery was accepted as a job and taxed. Prostitutes became special servants of the gods, and some people devoted young and beautiful girls to sacred temples, lustful devotion to temples, nudity, dancing, singing, and sacrifice to the gods. Eventually, corruption pervaded writers and philosophers, marriage became worthless, and divorce escalated, and it was not long before this moral decline wiped out their civilizations of Greece, Babylon, and so on. With all these interpretations, prostitutes in the minority and the majority of women, especially the upper classes of society, were chaste and faithful to the marriage covenant, and these same mothers had built the life structure of society. Prostitution and slavery have always been condemned, and shyness and the concealment of moral values. Prostitutes were present in the community in a place separate from chaste women, and the dance was performed for girls, not respectable women. Men who used prostitutes and slaves to satisfy their sexual needs used their legitimate wives to have a pure generation. In fact, maids, prostitutes, and dancers from the lower classes were sometimes seen naked and abused by men. With the rise of the Abrahamic religions and the spread of morality and spirituality, this prostitution and moral depravity diminished. Today, there is no news of kimono in Eastern countries, and no news of princess dresses and long skirts in Western countries. With the Zionist cultural policies, or rather the Illuminati and Freemasonry, which were based on unlimited human freedom and unrestricted gratification of sexual instinct, the change of dress style was key first in Western countries and then in Eastern countries. The promotion of nudity or the politics of hegemony first began in the 15th century as an anti-religious movement called the Renaissance. Of course, keep this in mind here, so that in the videos that I will make about these sinister and evil sects, namely Freemasonry and the Illuminati, I will explain to you with strong reasons and documents that the whole reason for their prevalence of nudity in humanity. What has happened? Will Durant writes in History of Civilization. The Renaissance was not a period of time, but a way of thinking and living that was shaped by the pressures of the Church's irrational rule from 1300 to 1500 AD, with the slogan of returning to the cultural heritage of ancient Rome and ancient Greece in Europe. This movement was formed with the ideology of worldliness and humanism and with the aim of removing God and morality from human life, and based on the exploitation of the naive and the suffering poor by certain people, and offered another interpretation of human perfection in which only his body is sanctified and centered. The criterion of virtue was introduced. Therefore, sensual pleasure, especially sexual pleasures, laid the foundation for a new lifestyle. In this thinking, the value of a woman is as much as her sexual pleasure. Renaissance art, which included paintings, sculptures, literature, and lustful novels. Art was a means of spreading lies about God and anti-religion, which, by depicting the brazenness of sexual nudity and even sexual organs, especially in women, in a way that entertained and delighted, did the most service to this movement, especially the rulers and the rich. Because the tools of art have a great effect on normalizing the shamelessness and desecration of sacred things. On the other hand, because the only medium at that time was painting and sculpture, this cultural invasion took place through them. The most famous Renaissance artists were Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael Sanzio, and Michelangelo. The desecration of Italy begins with the images of gods and prophets. The image of God, or Zeus, the god of the Greek gods, during sexual intercourse, and the images and statues of the prophets such as Adam and Eve, Jesus, John, David, etc., are also naked, and the image of the Blessed Virgin Mary is always drawn with modest veils, and some were photographed half naked. Although an anti-moral and anti-spiritual lifestyle was promoted by seemingly intellectuals in society, chastity and observance of moral boundaries were valued by the general public, and despite the influence of obscene thinking in the lower cultural strata of society, still witnessed the veiled concealment of individuals. We are especially women. In fact, modesty has officially existed in society, but indecency has occurred in art. Although the menstrual cycle dates back to the 16th to 16th centuries, European women did not change significantly in society until the 20th century, and only in the 18th century did their skirts move slightly off the ground. Finally, the promotion of bribery policies and unbridled culture, along with the groundwork that followed the Industrial Revolution, came to fruition in the early 20th century, when we first saw women's semi-nude veils in Europe. From 1921 onwards, skirts were shortened to the knees, an unprecedented event in the history of clothing. In the book History of Clothing, written by Ruth Turner, we read, "During World War II, women's shirts were shortened under the pretext of saving on fabric, but after the war, clothes became a little longer again." In the Pleasures of Philosophy book, Will Durant says, "Factors who were more self-interested and morally insignificant preferred factory workers, who were cheaper workers, to overly expensive rebellious men, forcing them to wear tight, short clothes when using dangerous machines. In this way, women also became industrialized in the industrial society, and men who sought to eliminate shame and modesty under the pretext of women's freedom and, in fact, to abuse them more, dragged women into the arena of prostitution. This forced nudity of women, along with the spread of a culture of consumerism, encouraged capitalists to use the physical attractiveness of women as a means of sexual pleasure and entertainment to make more profit and trade." In the Encyclopaedia Britannica, in the section on the relationship between industry and nudity, we read, "This violation of norms and increase of sexual stimuli in the society weakened and degraded the spirit of chastity and secrecy and increased sexual depression, naked prostitutes, prostitution and mental and psychological stagnation in the society." A few years after the beginning of nudity in the West, the social and family damage caused by it gradually began to appear in society. Intellectuals and social activists who could not remain silent seeing the problems caused by nudity opened their mouths to criticism. Susan F. The sexual revolution freed women from chastity and the concept of respect for women was ignored, Harding said. In this case, you can read the book Feminism is Not the Story of My Life, written by Elizabeth Fox Ganas. Mr. Sabalus, the head of the National Agency for Women Representatives in New York, says, "In our society, women are forced to be caught up in ridiculous standards of beauty every day to gain the approval of men. We made a trash can of freedom and threw everything we thought was restrictive to women, and you women use your mind, not your body." Wendy Shalott says, "Obviously, when we allow everything to be free, sexual harassment and rape will increase. A society that has declared war on shame is the enemy of women." Maggie, author of The Art of Chastity, wrote in her article, "It is not easy to get men to pay attention to your beliefs and values, but if you do not allow them to see much of your appearance, they will have to turn their attention to you." She writes, "I wear long skirts and button-down dresses to send the message to others that my personality is not limited to my appearance. When I entered high school, it was really harder for me to stick to my dress code and my values. I was an athlete and smart, I was a singer and an actor and the editor of a school magazine, but these did not match my friends' shorts. I was not even invited to the dance party of the last year. But I saw how my friends lost everything to boys who were just fascinated by their bodies, and then these boys left them alone and inflicted severe psychological damage on them. I will keep it, I will be happier." Wendy Shalott says, "These days from someone telling us, 'How beautiful you are. We like it and thank you.' But is this really the freedom we women seek? We are accustomed to superficial evaluations of others, and it may come as no surprise that low self-esteem is the most common problem of a postmodern woman. We are so accustomed to paying attention only to our appearance that we are almost oblivious to our true selves. Wearing more formal clothes is a sign that what is inside us is more valuable. What is inside us is generally called the soul and reminds us that there is something beyond the mere body." Well, so far we have only mentioned small parts of history that had nothing to do with the true Abrahamic religions, but we went back to about 4,000 years ago to tell you this. None of the anti-religious information given to us as human freedom is true, and the issue of hijab and especially the preservation of women's values has been an issue that has been of great importance throughout history. Well, the inscriptions and sculptures that have been confirmed by scientists, for example, 4,000 years ago, have nothing to do with the religions that are for 2,000 years later. Didn't that provoke something in your mind to think about? Even if we look at nature and pay attention to animals, we easily realize that even animals do many of the things that some humanoids do. They never do and always hide their genitals. Before the end of the first part of the series on the issue of hijab, I would like to say one thing to you women. You are not a tissue with which one person cleans himself every day and another the next day and the next day and the next day and the following days. If you women have really come to this conclusion and accepted that you are a toy for improper and principled sexual pleasures and pleasures for men, I am really sorry for you. Don't you think that you can only belong to one man while he belongs only to you? Both mentally and physically, morally, and conscientiously? Do you want your daughter's children, who do not know what kind of man they come from, to become a puppet for men's evil lusts? I do not mean to eliminate your sexual needs and lust, it is not at all, but every healthy person definitely has sexual needs. I mean, everything is legal and this sexual instinct can be turned into beautiful and romantic moments that are unique to you and your true love, instead of becoming our inner animal. Of course, not a love that changes every day and every week. Well, here is the end of the first part of the video series on hijab and the value of women. Certainly what you said was welcome and acceptable to some of you, but it does not matter to me. As a human being, I have said things that are enough for me, even if it makes a person think and return to his human values. Please do not forget to subscribe, count and like and be sure to activate the bell button. The collection of videos on hijab and the value of women is still ongoing. Wishing the appearance of the promised Mahdi. Goodbye.